So once again, it's always a pleasure and a privilege. I think this topic wasn't planned in advance, but besides the fact that it's a fascinating sugya, being the son of survivors, my father and mother, both were survivors, and I am the Talmud of one of the greatest survivors in the Jewish world. Being a Talmud of the Kloisam HaGerevi, who probably did more than any other individual to rekindle the spirit of Klal Yisrael after the devastation and the tragedy of the Holocaust. Probably more than any other individual, he went through the war, lost his wife and 11 children, his entire family. And I remember once in a private conversation, wasn't in public, but I heard from my great Rebbe from the Kloisam Rebbe, of kan ein rega v'chnish maharal gevein achrei midaisav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not for one moment did I question HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ways. I shuddered when I heard those words, and I feel the same every time I repeat them. So last week we started Parshas Lech Lecha, the story of Avraham Avinu, and this week is a continuation of the Asura Nisyonis Nisnas Avraham Avinu V'Omed V'Kulam. Rashi in Masechet Avos on this Mishnah, Rashi writes, Asura Nisyonis Nisnas Avraham Avinu V'Omed V'Kulam V'Lo Hirher Achrei Midasav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was the Madrega of Avraham Avinu. That is what I heard from my great Rebbe. So I was always extremely interested in anything that has to do with the Shoah, with the Holocaust. Halachic discussions, Hashkafa. I must apologize. Sometimes I just forget. I need to turn off my phones. I'll be back in a moment. I didn't find the phone. It'll probably ring again. I hope it won't. So, as I said, I was always extremely interested. So I just can't, I had an urge to share with you one of the tragic halachic questions from that era. There's no other people in the world that deals with questions like these, ethical dilemmas like these. It is only Klal Yisrael, as Asher Yohav Hashem Yochiach. In our tragic experiences, we needed to deal with questions like these. So after 2 weeks in which we discussed the various different aspects in the sugya of Ma'abedatz Maladas, and we dealt at length with the opinion of Tosfos in Git Nun Zayin Amud Beis, that a person is entitled to take his life if he's terrified and afraid of torture, when he knows that by all reasonable likelihood he will be killed and he will be tortured till before he'll be killed, he has the right to take his life. And that is the interpretation of Tosfos in Gittin Nun Zayin in the story of Daled Meiles Yelodim, the 400 children, boys and girls, that jumped into the sea and committed suicide when they were on their way to Rome from Eretz Yisrael. And that is the interpretation of Tosfos in Shaul HaMelech, that took his life. And Chazal say, Ebzal Shaul HaMelech from any Avera. And Shaul wasn't over Avera. And the question we ask is, in that situation, is there a heter for another person to take his life? Is it only the person who is afraid of torture? It's a heter only for him, or could he ask someone else, please kill me? So, in 3 Svarim of Gedolei Yisrael, do we find Shuvas written dealing with the same question, with the same transit question. Minchas Yitzchak, Hagon Rabbi Yitzchak Yankel Weiss, who was the Rav of Manchester, and in the past 20 years of his life, the Gaivid of the Eid HaRav in Yerushalayim, considered one of the major, first and foremost, poskim of our time. Mishnah Halachas, Hagon Rabbi Menashe Klein, who was also a great gadol and a poskim. I did not know Rav Weiss personally, but Rabbi Menashe Klein was a very close friend of our family and to me personally. When he built a shikun in Ramot Dalet, he came to visit me in my house. We had a beautiful visit. I remember him from my childhood years. I was a little boy and he spent the Shabbos in our home. So the Menashe Klein has a tshuva in Shalos Tshuva Mishnah Halachos, and Reb Nosson Gestetner was a tremendous Talmid Chacham. His tshuvas are outstanding tshuvas, some of the best that we have of our generation. Shalos Tshuvas Lahodas Nosson. And they deal with a situation which a person turned to the Chechenev Rebbe. Chechenev Rebbe was, I think his name was Sholem Yecheskel Shimon Rubin Halbeshtam. He was an anikel of the Divrei Chaim, but not Ben Achabed. So his name was actually Rubin. But being a Hasidic Rebbe and a descendant of the Divrei Chaim, he wouldn't forego such a prestigious name, Halbeshtam. So he called himself Reb Sholem Yecheskel Rubin Halbeshtam. He wrote a Sefer Taharas Yom Tov, many volumes, and his thing was Hilchas Makvois. He was an expert in Makvois, and that was what his Sefer was about. But he turned to those 3 Gedolim with a tragic question. A person who was one of the ghettos in Poland. I don't think the Tshuvas say which ghetto it happened, but in one of the ghettos. And the Nazis gave an order that the Jews need to turn in any fur they have, whether it's a fur hat or a fur coat, or any furs need to be turned in. And the decree said, any Jew that will not turn in his furs in 24 hours, and he will be caught possessing fur, will be killed on the spot. And they took 3 elders of the community, of the ghetto, 3 Anoshim Mechobodim, and they said, you bear responsibility. And if we will find fur in any Jew's possession, you will be tortured to death. As you could expect, we know ourselves, we know our people. There's always that oibachochem that thinks he's smarter than everyone else and he'll get away with it. So the vast majority of people turned in their furs, but the Nazis did find fur in the possession of one Jew. He was killed on the spot, shot in the head, and they took those 3 Zikainim and they tortured him, and it was a public spectacle. Like that Surah Aruge Malchus, like the story of Reb Chanina ben Teradian and Avodah Zarah, the Romans tortured him in the presence of his Talmidim. Last week we spoke at length about it, and we have it on this week's source sheet as well. So his family was standing there. They tortured these 3 people one after the other. The first, Nafach Nishmosei, the first died in terrible pain. And they started torturing person number 2. His son was looking there and he was devastated. And the executioner, I don't know whether he was a Jewish capo or a German guard, I don't know. He saw that his son is wearing a gold watch. So he turned to the son of this person that's being tortured and he said, if you give me your gold watch, I'll put a bullet in his head and I'll salvage him from this pain and terrible suffering. His son took his watch off his wrist, gave it to that brutal murderer, Yamach Shemai, and he put a bullet in his head. And after the war, after the revelation, the son survived and he was riddled with guilt that I killed my father. Did I kill my father? Do I bear responsibility? Ultimately, I paid someone to take his life. And just an interesting note, these shuvas were written between Tovshin Lamed Beis and Tovshin Lamed Daled. That's almost 30 years after liberation. Obviously, it took that person decades till he could muster the courage and the strength to turn to someone and tell the story. So these three Gedolim wrote interesting shuvas. I'm not going to go through the lengthy discussion, but I would just note the Jew of the Minchas Yitzchak. So, the Shlomo, could we have it on our screen?
Yes, we're putting it right up.
So, let's just have a brief look at the Shaila. Misha Goram ba'akifin lahag de mises of mitoch rachmones be'mei hazam. So he writes the Tshuva of the Chechen of a Rebbe. So, ish echad shemavakesh la'oiris lo derech Tshuva be'mei shultan ha'natzim betkufas ha'natzim bePolania. He was with his father. V'asu magbit shel parva. It's not a magbit. A magbit, translated into Lashon Kodesh is an appeal. Sounds like they had some innocent appeal for parva. Chrizu ha'natzim. שעד יום מסוים מחויבים למסור הכל ליד השלטון. ואצל מי שימצאו אחר כך פיסת פרווה, אחז דוס על ההומס. חוץ מזה עשו 3 יהודים, מזיקנו העד האחרון בעד המבצע, וממוץ הפרווה אצל היוחד, אחר הזמן יהרגו גם 3. כמובן, כל היהודים מסרו את כל המלבושים והמגבות שהיו בהם פרווה, רק אך היום הם שערכו חיפושים, מצאו אצל איש אחד כובש של פרווה, ותכף הרגו השלוש הזקנים שעשם אחרונים בעד המבצע, והתחילו לאנוס וייסורים קושים ומורים לעיני הצבא, ואחד פעמס מייסוריו. והשני פרפר בין חיים ומובס, והשלישי כבר התחילו להכות, וזה היה עובב של השואל. הונו אחד הממונים להכוס עד מובס על בנוי בהצעה, תיתן לישון זהב, הוציא אקדח, והרגהו בירייה, ויהיה לו מיסה קלו. ולא יסבול יסורים כמו קודמיו. וכך היה, והרגוהו ביריעה. כעת מצפנו מענה אותו, אלא לא יטריב עושו, שסייע בהגרום על ההריג הסובב, ובו ומקש להויס בדרך תשובו. שחושב שאלי מולי לא יהרגו באקדח, או יונס הנס, או יונישו בחיים. So, what a question. And the Minchas Yitzchak, first of all, I noted before, this Shuv is written Tovshin Lamed Beis. That is 28 years after it was all over. And the Minchas Yitzchak wisely doesn't really go into halachic analysis. His Shuva is relatively short. And what he says is, we can never judge anyone in those circumstances. Shikoris velo miyayin. Those weren't normal times. People, their minds were totally shattered and their neshamas and their hearts broken into a million pieces. So the Minchas Yitzchak, I think wisely, doesn't really go into lumdus, he says these people can never be judged. We shouldn't dare to judge them. So let's just have a look at the last 3 lines. It's a very brief tshuva. Mi hushi yachoylem lachayev oisei afam loy kiven kahalocha b'matzav kazeh meroy vatlois vatzoris. Omnam, kol ma sheyaseh tzedakah v'chesed lezichro nishmas ovev yachoshev loy v'la'ovev letzedakah gedola. U'mi she'omer loy lo maydai yoymer letzoroseinu dai v'niske v'koroiv. So I think, this tshuva is a case study. It is, instead of going into a pilpul, he absolves the person totally. But he does recommend, give tzedakah, do masim toivim, buhurachum yechaperovim. The Mishnah Halachah Zayrem Nosen Gestetna go into a lengthy analysis. The Mishnah Halachas deals with various different aspects. Broiloi misi yafa. I don't think that's relevant. Let's scroll down. Maybe I'll just point out some lines, you know. So he also writes, Ein Odam Nitbes Betzaroi, but he does go into a lengthy analysis. First, he brings the thesis when a person is afraid of torture, he has the right to take his life. But would that include others? Could another person take his life as well? And then he deals with various different aspects. So, let's stay where we are right now. Last two lines. ולפי זה פושט הזוקן לעצמו, ימות על לעצמו מינויים קושים, ובקושי שימסהו הראש, ולא יסריעו מקס בלי קצבו. ממילא גם בנוי שעושה שליחוסו, ועושה בזה שהיא לטבעסוי. He doesn't really mean shlichus, but maybe the heter would include others as well. He is not conclusive about this, but he does bring it up as a tzad. So if we can move fast forward to the end of this tshuva, I'm not sure that we have it on our sheet because it's a very lengthy tshuva, and I asked my son-in-law to just have the relative sections. So at the end of his tshuva, he's quite harsh with a person that asked the question. And he said, well, the Rambam says, if you hire a person to kill, even if he's a guy, you hire misa b'dei shemayim. But because he was machaven l'shem shemayim, then we should not be too harsh with him. Mesiv number 3, Rav Nosson Gestetner writes an extremely lengthy tshuva. It's interesting. This is the date on this tshuva is Tavshin Lamed Daled. Same shoyl, same story. Maybe it's just a mistake. So he also has an extremely lengthy discourse, a lengthy discussion. And what I want to share with you is my opinion based on what we learned in the past 2 weeks. So we will briefly being over some of the sources we dealt with, but with emphasis on the fundamental question. If a person has a heter to commit suicide to save himself from torture, would that include others? Or would it be a heter only for him and for no one else? About 15 years ago, I wrote a tshuva to a person, slightly different story. And it might be surprising because I'm a generation younger than the Gedolim I quoted. The Minchas Yitzchak was the oldest of them. The 2 others were somewhat younger than him, but I also had similar questions, and a person turned to me and he told me the story of his father. His father, once again, was a survivor. His father survived the camps, and he saw his father being tortured before his eyes and before the eyes of the entire family. He offered the murderer money. He initiated. He said, I'll give you money if you let him go. And the person said, I can't let him go because then I'll be killed. But if you give me money, I'll kill him immediately and you'll save him from pain. So he gave him the money. In the case I did with, his father heard this discussion, and his father turned to his son and he begged him, please give him whatever he wants. I cannot bear this. Please save me from this. And this person passed away. He never asked the question. His son, after the Shiva, after the Shloshim, his son was tormented by his father's story, and his son turned to me, who was no longer negayed to his father. Obviously, this person never had the courage to confront, but many times he spoke to his children about his pain, paying someone to kill his father. And I did write an interesting tshuva. So now I want to go back to the fundamental sources. Shmuel Aleph, Perek Lamed Beis. Let's once again read the story of Shaul HaMelech. Reb Shlomo, could we have it on the screen?
About to be there.
And then Shmuel Beis. And this is interesting. The story begins in the very last Perek of Shmuel Aleph, and it continues in the very beginning of Shmuel Beis, which is interesting. Shaul was afraid. He saw the Amalekim and the Pelishtim approaching with their spears and bows and arrows. ויען איזה כלב כימי שול ויפל גם הוא אחריו וימות עמו. ויום שול ושלושת בונו ונויסה כלב גם כל אנושיו ביום ההוא יחדיו. So that's the story of Shaul's demise at the end of Shmuel Aleph. As we noted last week, Pashtus HaPosach seems he wasn't afraid he's going to be Oved Avodah Zorah. He was afraid they're going to degrade him, humiliate him, and mevaze him, and he's going to suffer. So in the pasuk we just read, it seems that Shaul committed suicide. He threw himself on his sword. But there's a different narrative in the beginning of Shmuel Beis. David fought the Amalekim. He was victorious. David didn't know what happened with Shaul. He didn't know. And this person comes, Adomo Aroisha, Bevoy David, Beyipalatso, Beyishtachava, Beyoimare David, Aimazay Tova, Beyoimare Love, Memachane Yasol, and Latati. I was successful in running away from our army. Beyoimare of David, Maho Yoadova, Haged Noli, what happened? Beyoimer Ashenasu Menamalchamo, Begam Harbe Nafal Menuam, Beyamusu, Begam Shol, Beyonisem Benoi Mesu. Shaul and his son Yonasan perished. V'yomer David el Anar Hamagid loy, Eich Yudatu Kimei Shaul v'Yonasan loy. How do you know that Shaul died? V'yomer Anar Hamagid loy, Nikro nekresi b'Hara Gilboa, v'hene Shaul nish'an al chanito, v'hene arechev v'bali aproshem idbikuhu. Shaul was leaning on his spear, and the Amalekim, the Pelishtim, already caught up with him. And Shaul noticed that I'm standing there. Shaul asked this Amaleki, please kill me because I'm suffering and I'm still alive. Va'amid olav va'amois esayel ki yodati ki lo yichya achroi nofloi ve'ekach hanezer asher aroisho v'yetzodo va'aviyam aladoini heinu. So this Amaleki tells David, I killed Shaul, and here's his crown. I bought you his crown. And then David does kriya. V'yoyim David anara maged loi eisa me'ato. Who are you? V'yoyim loi ben ishger Amaleki yonoichi. ויאמר אליו דוד, איך לא יורסו לשלוח ידך לשחס את משיח השם, ויקרא דוד לאחד הנאורם ויאמר גש פגע בו, So David killed him. V'yomer elav David, Domachal roishcho, ki picho ono b'cho leimor, unoichi mesaisi es Mashiach Hashem. So first of all, how does this story fit in with the end of Shmuel Aleph? Who killed Shaul? Did he commit suicide? Or did this Amaleki kill him? The Radak and the Ralbag both explain he was leaning on his sword. Because he dressed up in armor, the sword didn't really penetrate deep enough. He was bleeding. He was mortally wounded, but he was still alive. And he wanted to die before the Amalekim, before the Pelishtim captured. So he was wounded. And that is what David says, I'm still alive. So that's the story. So why did
this picture's
it
not there?
kill?
Pesach or Oswald? No.
Are we okay? Are we on the same page?
Yes.
So the question is, why did this Amaleki deserve to be killed? Was he over on a chet by killing Shaul? Wouldn't we assume that Shaul nohag Halachah? I mean, Chazal say Shaul was okay. And Shaul twice asked someone to kill him. In Shmuel Aleph, the Noise Kalim. But the Noise Kalim froze. He was in some sort of paralysis. He couldn't bring himself to act. And then he asked the Amaleki, and the Amaleki did do what he asked him to do. So why did David kill him? I don't know. Maybe just because he was an Amaleki. Tim Chazecher Amalek. I don't know. But from the exchange.
But he was a ger. He was a ger, no?
Yeah, so that is a big discussion. Do we accept Gerim from Amalek? The Rambam says yes. Many disagree with the Rambam. So we don't really know whether Ger Amaleki means a Ger Tzedek, or sometimes a Ger is a Ger Toishav. Sometimes Ger means, I'm just a visitor. I don't know. The Meforshim don't make this clear. From the exchange, David seems to be very angry. How did you dare? So, this is not a Gemara, and we don't have the Rashba and the Ramban and Rashi and Tosfos. None of the Meforshim on the spot really explain why was this Amaleki killed. But we should assume that if Shaul asked number one and number two, please kill me, that was beheta and not be'isa. Because we quoted a week and two ago, some say maybe Shaul didn't act Halachah. The B'Yosef brings the Orchos Chaim. But the Medrash says Shaul did act Halachah. And if the Medrash says Shaul was a Ma'abed Atzma L'das and he had a heter, it must include this Amaleki, because ultimately it wasn't Shaul that killed himself, it was this Amaleki. Why did he deserve to be killed? I don't know. Maybe David was angry. How did you dare? When Shaul asked the Noise Kalim to kill him, the Noise Kalim couldn't dare. He just froze. He was afraid. Why weren't you afraid? I don't know. And this brings us to source number 3, the Gemara and Avodah Zarah. So let's scroll down and have an additional look at the Gemara. So this story we already analyzed at length. Reb Chanina ben Teradi doesn't want to open his mouth. And he says, I will not actively do anything to hasten my demise. But then when Klatz Tanuri, we need to scroll down a bit more to the next page. But then when Klatz Tanuri asks him, Im ani marve b'shalheves v'noik l'sfugim shel tzemer ma'ali bicho, ato meviani l'chayel mabo. If I hasten your death, I'm going to take the wet tzemer off your heart and I'm going to stoke the fire, adding firewood. It should be a bigger fire to salvage you from suffering. Do you promise me olam haba? Amar le'hein, hishovali nishbalol miyad. Hibbe b'shaleves, not l'sfugen shal tzem alibo, yotze nishmosei b'meheiro. Yotze baskal v'amro, Reb Chanina ben Teradian v'klatz toniri mizamonim l'chayei olam haba. So Reb Chanina ben Teradian promised him olam haba and he swore to him. Can be that was an avera. And the baskal went out of the heavens that klatz toniri is mizamonim l'chayei olam haba. If he murdered Reb Chanina ben Teradian, he doesn't deserve chayei olam haba. So these two sources show, and even more so, Reb Chanina ben Teradian, to me prove that if the person that is suffering has a heter, that heter would include anyone else fulfilling his wish. So the tzad hashava, the common denominator between these two stories, Shaul HaMelech on one hand, Reb Chanina ben Teradian on the other, they clearly asked an other person, please hasten my demise. Reb Chanina ben Teradian pleaded with klatz tanuri, promised him olam haba, swore that he'll have olam haba, and Shaul HaMelech pleaded with the noisa kalim, number one, and with the Amaleki, number two. So now let's go to the end of our sheet, number 8, 9, 10, on the last page that I sent. So how do we define the heter? Here we are. How do we define the heter of Shaul HaMelech? This brings us back to Siman Shin Mem He and Yoredeya. And as I explained last week, the poskim never deal with a heter to commit suicide. We will never tell a person mutar. Even in the Holocaust, people did what they did out of desperation. We will never give a heter to a person to take his life. Never. And that is why the poskim deal with the sugya only in the context of avelis, in a b'diavad situation. Will we be noeg avelis? Will we bury him together with all the others? Do we do kriya? Would we say a hesped? And as I pointed out last week, the poskim are extremely lenient, extreme kulas. I won't go over again what we learned just a week ago, but I want to be medayik the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch. Kotten ha'ma'abed atzma ledas, choshev kishalo ledas. If it's a cotton, we never judge him as a ma'abed atzma ledas, but it's because it doesn't have das. V'chein god la'ma'abed atzma ledas v'hu onus kishol ha'melech ein moine memeno kol dor. So the Shulchan Aruch seems to define the story of Shaul HaMelech as oines. If it's defined as an oines, the person suffering, he's an oines because the pain is unbearable. But that wouldn't be a heter for another person to kill him. You're not an oines. This is your eretzeach. So if the heter is based on the concept of oines, the heter wouldn't include anyone else. Because oines rachmona patre. So if we explain the heter, when a person is suffering, he has the din of an oines rachmona patre. That would only be a ptor for him, not for anyone else. And therefore, pshitali, that the Mechaber doesn't really mean the din of oines. The Mechaber uses the word onus, but what the Shulchan Aruch means to say is, he didn't commit suicide out of sorrow, distress, depression. It was just to salvage and save himself from unbelievable suffering. Let's see the Shach. That means he wasn't suffering yet. He was just afraid of what might be coming. That's not a oines. There's a fundamental Gemara in Bava Basra Mem Chesed Beis. The Gemara differentiates between Onse de Nafshei and Onse de Chavrei, which means if a person sells an object and he's forced to sell, there's a machlokes in the Gemara, zvina is zvina or lo. Is that transaction valid or not? Then the Gemara makes an argument. Nobody sells personal belongings only if he is in distress. Because we're dealing with personal belongings. It's not a store. Person sells his clothes, his furniture, his sforim. Probably he's in financial stress. Why wouldn't that be an onus? The Gemara says no. Onse de nafshei is never an onus. He is in financial stress. But ultimately, who decided to sell? Wasn't imposed on him. Great. Is this Amud Aleph or Amud Beis?
This is Amud Beis, Rabbi.
Okay. Oh, I didn't expect you to put my memory to test. We go to Amud Aleph. Oh, it's very important that a person like me sometimes is caught. Mem Zayin Amud Beis? It definitely is here. If I will get up to the bookshelf, I'll find it in a second. Here we are. Okay.
We're looking for Talia's oven?
Yes, just one moment. Turn the page. Forward. Next page.
From Mem Zayin Amud Beis. Mem Zayin Amud Beis.
Towards the bottom.
Mem Zayin Amud Beis.
Yeah, Mem Zayin Amud Beis. How do we get to this?
4 lines from the bottom.
Here we are.
Mem Zayin Amud Beis. 4 lines from the bottom. Pesach, go down. You're going the wrong way.
Here we are. Talia v'zaven zvina zvina, my tama. Call the masben inish, ilav the onis, lo have a masben. When a person sells his personal belongings, if he wouldn't be an onis, he wouldn't sell. Afilochas zvina zvina. Vedil meshane onse de nafshei, ma onse de achrena. We could have a look at the Rishbam at the bottom of the page, but what the Gemara says is an oinus is only if someone else imposed on you to sell. But when the decision is yours, nobody forced you clearly to sell, you are an here. Shana onse da nafshei, shetzorach lamoise v'torchach moichech v'eisem edato. So the Gemara differentiates. A person is in financial stress. He wouldn't like to sell, but he needs to sell. But it's not defined as an onus, because at the end of the day, he made the decision to sell. An onus is only when a person is forced to sell. And it is the same in our case. When you are threatened and forced to bow down to Avodah Zorah, if not, we're going to kill you, that's an onus. But when you are afraid, they're going to torture me, and you decide to take your life, that is not an onus. So let's go back to our source sheet. The Shulchan Aruch. The page we were on 5 minutes ago. The sheet that I sent over. No, not the sources in the Gemara.
No, Pesach, the morning sources.
It takes a second to get there. I'm sorry.
Here we are. So even though the Shulchan Aruch uses the word oinus, it's not really the Haggadah of oinus. Like the Shach says, he decided to kill himself because he was afraid of the Pelishtim. So the earliest source is Tosfos. And I just want to point out, Tosfos doesn't use the word oinus. Kafzu kuran v'nafru l'toich hayam. V'hod omer v'mesechet avodah zorah mutav shiet lana mishana sana v'alechem yereim hoyu miyasurim. Yereim hoyu miyasurim. And therefore they had the right to take their lives. And that is why I argue that if the person that is afraid of torture has the right, he could ask someone else to do it. And the heter would include that other person. And the sources are Reb Chanina ben Teradion and Kratz the Nuri and Shaul HaMelech. So it's still a mystery, which the Mefarshim do not explain. Why exactly did David kill that Amaleki? Who knows? Maybe he was an Amaleki. And I just want to point out, Din Malchus is not necessarily Halachah of Shulchan Aruch. From the Psukim, it seems that David was furious. How could you dare l'shloyach yad b'mashiach Hashem? V'yomer elav David, eich lo yoresu l'shloyach yotchu l'shachis es Mashiach Hashem. So even if he wasn't Chayev Mises Bezdin, but Din Malchus is different. And Melech Yisrael has the authority to judge a person, even if it's not Lefi HaHalocha Mishpat HaSanhedrin. So these two sources, Shaul HaMelech and Reb Chanina ben Teradion, to me are clear. In those circumstances in which we say the person could take his life, he could ask someone else to do it. So the tshuva I wrote to the person posthumously, and I wrote his son, what a chaval that your father didn't turn to me while he was alive. You know, we could probably ease his conscience and ease his pain. So contrary to the three tshuvas that I mentioned, my psak would be, he had a heter to do whatever he did and his intentions were good. But the story they talk about is slightly different than the one I dealt with. Because in the story I dealt with, father turned to son and pleaded with him, please give him whatever he wants and I want to get over it. I can't bear this. So I think there was more room for a heter in the tshuva that Minchas Yitzchak and others deal with. Obviously, his father was no longer in a state in which he could express his will, and it was the son's decision to act on his own. So we should never, ever need to deal with questions of this nature. So we had a 3-week course of dealing with Ma'avadas Manadas, and I think it was a very interesting discussion. And let us hope that we won't have questions of this nature either. So when I speak about this, I just want to stress how important it is for parents and educators just to be aware when children are in distress and encourage our children, if anything is on their mind and if anything bothers them, they should never be afraid to talk. Because it is very common that children are troubled and they have issues and they're either ashamed or afraid to talk. And when we become aware of their problems, sometimes it's tragically too late. So whether it's mechanchim or it's parents, we need to be very receptive and very sensitive and be involved in the lives of our talmidim and our children, be aware when they seem to be troubled, and create an atmosphere in which children are never afraid to talk. And if anything troubles them and bothers them, they should understand that they will always have an open ear and an open heart, and we will be there for them. And I think that is the most we could do to prevent the tragedy of young people committing suicide. So the high-profile cases were not the typical ones. the vast majority of suicide in our society are young people in their teens, and not the ones that are in crisis because of special circumstances. So I do think that just by creating an atmosphere in which children will never be afraid to talk if something bothers them, and our sensitivity in realizing when they are having trouble, we could prevent tragedy and prevent a lot of these cases. Okay, so Shlomo, you'll be in touch with me, and we'll see what we're going to do next week.
Yes, just one or two comments from the Olam for the Rav. This is just a general comment. What the Rav would say about this. Rav, the Mishnah Halachah from Nasha Klein, writing in 1972, 50 years ago, he starts his tshuva by saying how terrible it is that we have already forgotten the Holocaust. I don't know if I've heard it from him directly or otherwise. His Masha Machiv is Kamashakhu Esakoyel Masha Aslanu Hanru Rishayim. 50 years ago. There's only 25 years after the Holocaust. What is the Rav's hadracha to his Talmidim and Eretz Yisrael about teaching the Holocaust and making sure that we don't forget this? He brings a Targum Yonasan, I think, which says even B'dar the Mashiach, we can't forget Amalek. So we can't forget the Germans. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, so 13 years ago, I had a trip to Poland. We visited Kivrei Tzadikim. I gave a shia in Yeshivas Chachma Rablin. And the sugya I discussed in Yeshivas Chachma Rablin was Mordechai Romkovsky, vice versa, Adam Chernikov. I don't know whether these two names speak to anybody listening to me. Chernikov, Adam, was the head of the Judenrat in Warsaw, in the Warsaw ghetto. Romkovsky was the head of the Judenrat in the Lodz ghetto. When the Nazis demanded from the Warsaw ghetto a list of people to be sent to the gas chambers, Adam Chernikov put his name on the top of the list, number one, and all the other names were empty. And he refused to cooperate. And he put a bullet into his head and committed suicide because he just knew that if he doesn't cooperate with the Nazis, they'll kill anyone and everyone, and they'll torture him. So it's so typical today. Mordechai Romkovsky cooperated with the Nazis fully. And there's this very famous tragic scene which some survivors describe. He called together the ghetto and he pleaded with them they should all give away their kids to be murdered. And the people started screaming and crying. It was a horrific sight. And he tried to convince them, if they're going to kill their parents, the children will die anyway. So let's give away the kids to save our own lives. So could you imagine a Yiddish tata, a Yiddish mama, giving away the children to be sent to be killed to save themselves? So I have first-hand testimony, and this is amazing, because historians have different opinions what happened with Mordechai Romkovsky at the end. I heard from a person that heard from his father that was present when he arrived in Auschwitz. He approached one of the Nazi officers and he introduced himself. I am Mordechai Romkovsky. I am the head of the Judenrat of the Lodz ghetto. You can't do this to me. I deserve special treatment. And the officer said, wow, you're head of the Judenrat, then you're going to get special treatment. They tore off his clothes, threw him into a pit, doused him with gasoline, and put on a fire. And he had a Misa Mishana worse than all the others. So the topic I discussed in Yeshivas Chachma Lublin was the halachic perspective, which I won't go over now. It's a fascinating shir. Oh, what did I want to say? My father came along with us. And after 70 years, my father stood at the train station in Birkenau, and he said, this is where I last saw my Zaydis, Bovis, my father and mother, and 5 of my siblings, who went one way, and I and my 2 brothers went the other way. And in Minchas Shamunah V'Betochen, there's a special section about the Holocaust. I don't know whether you have the Sefer. It's an important Sefer, Minchas Shamunah V'Betochen. And there's a special section, the Sichos, the talks that I gave when I visited those sites. On one hand, I think it is imperative. We must remember the Holocaust. We cannot forget. But I do want to point out the difficulty we have. What exactly do we stress when we teach the Holocaust? What do we focus on? And I know personally from some Gedolim that we're very afraid because focusing on the mega tragedy might arouse questions in Amunah. In Betochen, it is hard to tell a story of 1 million Yiddish kinderlich that perished without young people asking, how could this be? Why did this happen? We have difficulty coping with tragedy, but with mega tragedy would be a greater difficulty. So we try to focus less on the tragedy and more on the sparks of Mesirus Nefesh, of Kiddush Hashem, and there were many. But it's not the overall narrative of the Holocaust. The Holocaust wasn't essentially a story of heroics. It's a story of unbelievable tragedy and devastation. So on one hand, I think we cannot forget, but it's very sensitive to develop a curriculum. What exactly do we teach? We cannot be false. We need to be truthful. But we should stress not the horrific tragedy into itself, because I am concerned sometimes what the response will be and what the result will be. We need to find the right balance. Yes, to relay the message of tragedy, because that is what we do on Tisha B'Av. We sit on the floor and we mourn. We don't stress the Mesirus Nefesh, but the tragedy. But this is so fresh in our minds that we have to find the right balance between the stories of Mesirus Nefesh and the tragedy that befell our people. But I definitely think, I am involved trying to get funds for Ginzach Kiddush Hashem in Bnei Brak. I brought together a group of philanthropists. It's not a kollel, it's not a yeshiva, but I think we owe it to our grandparents to tell their story. There are many Holocaust museums in the world, but there is only one Frum group. And I think I owe it to my Zaydis and to my Rebbe, the Kloisenberg Rebbe, to tell their story as well. And their narrative is a narrative of Kiddush Hashem. So I think I very much identify with Rebbe Menashe Klein, and I knew him, and he lived the Holocaust. He was, paradoxically, a friend with Elie Wiesel. And Elie Wiesel donated the money to build the Menashe Klein Shul in Ungvar in Yerushalayim, because Elie Wiesel was from Ungvar, and they had a friendly relationship. And nobody did more than Elie Wiesel for the world to bring the Holocaust awareness. So the Menashe Klein really lived the memory of the Shoah. He lived it every day. So I'm not surprised about his comment that he wrote 50 years ago. 50 years passed since then. And I do think that we don't do enough. And that is why I am involved in a certain degree in trying to help this institution. Eliezer was from Sigit, but I think he went to yeshiva in Ungvar. Yeah, he had a connection with Ungvar. I know that he was from Sigit.
Wasn't so far away.
Yeah, very close. Okay, any other comments? Any other questions?
Yeah, there's a halachic shayla. Maisa Reb Nosson Gestetner at the end of his tshuva says that he brings this startling thing that if you're Mekadosh Shem Shemaim, you don't hear the Yisurim, you don't feel the Yisurim. The Rav remembers this, what he brings from the Rishonim, and he says Yitachein that maybe this father would have been in this madrega, and therefore you should have let him live. The problem with that is that seems to be nistar, as the Rav said earlier, from the source of Bechlinim Betrajan. So
yeah.
Is there any...
The source is a Tashbitz Koton. There's a sefer called Tashbitz Koton. I think it's Us Kuf Memvav, if my memory is correct. But I already proved that today by the shir, I proved that my memory is not that great. I confused Memtes with Mem Zayin.
That's the exception that proves the rule.
Okay, so the Tashbitz Koton, my memory might be faltering. I think it's Kuf Memvav. Tashbitz Koton is not from the Tashbitz. It's from the Talmidim of Maram Rutenburg. And they quote in his name that if a person is Moise Nefesh, he doesn't feel the Yisurim. Well, in most sources, it doesn't seem to be so. What do we need more than a Bekiva? Sorkam B'Surah B'Misleka Shabazel. Makabla Ol Malchus Shemayim Bava. And the Gemara seems to make it clear he was suffering, but in his gewaldige greatness, he was Makabel al Malchus Shemayim B'Yava. So Maram Rutenburg is the source, and Tashbitz Koton is Talmidim. I just want to point out that the greatest Talmidim of Maram Rutenburg were murdered al Kiddush Hashem. It was a tragic period. The three greatest Talmidim of Maram Rutenburg were the Rosh, the Mordechai, and the Goas Maimonides. The Mordechai and Aguas Maimonides were murdered by the Crusaders. Maram Rutenburg died in prison. Those were Mesiras Nefeshim. And that was when the Rosh ran away from Toledo in northern Spain, where the Christians conquered, and he ran down to southern Spain, to Barcelona, which was ruled by the Muslims. And that is how the Rosh saved his life. The Torah's wife committed suicide because she was afraid that the Christians would force her to Din Avodah Zarah. So the Maram Rutenburg was a very tragic period of Mesiras Nefesh. So maybe what he says fits into that context. But the source that a person is Mesiras Nefesh, he doesn't feel pain, is in Sefer Tashbitz Koton in the name of Maram Rutenburg. But the Gemaras seem to indicate otherwise, Rabbi Kiva and Reb Chanina ben Teradian. So if Reb Chanina ben Teradian didn't feel pain, why did he ask Karatz Tenuri to hasten his demise? So if Rabbi Kiva and Reb Chanina ben Teradian weren't great enough to achieve that madrega, so when a person sees his father crying out in anguish, he definitely shouldn't assume that his father is putting on a show and he's not feeling pain.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kveid Rav, as always.
I hope next week we'll have a more uplifting topic.
Well, I'll write to Rav Binam Beinish.
Okay, Kol Tov, have a great day.
Everybody have a good day.